We could say applied zooarchaeology, the Oregon coast is a transitional zone for sea otters. We could also say a tale of two studies at the end. I always give this talk, and then at the end, I'm never sure which one's right. Neither is right, hopefully, but you'll see how archaeology can provide a lot of information to some of these questions. So I'm an anthropology and archaeology student, and in particular, I'm a zooarchaeologist, which means I hang out with animal bones. I can now spot a sea otter bone from 10 feet away. I've become perhaps a little too specialized. As an anthropologist, I would like to follow Barbara's lead and acknowledge that we are not just on land today, we are on homeland for Oregon tribes. And although my study is going to be somewhat technical, I'd also ask you all to keep in mind that these were animals that interacted with humans and shared space with humans, and they derive from this cultural context, and they were used by Oregon tribal ancestors. So that's something in my work I try not to lose sight of, even when you're just working with the animals. So today I'm going to share the results of my master's project, which I finished in 2016. It's also now out in marine mammal science. And this study used pre-contact sea otter teeth from the Oregon coast to try and address sort of environmental history questions and conservation questions. So bear with me if I get jargony, please raise your hand and ask. But again, sort of sites left by tribal ancestors have the data to potentially inform a lot of ecological questions and conservation questions. And so this is something that zooarchaeologists especially think about. What can we bring to these conversations? So for my master's, I followed up on one tiny aspect of this big picture by following in the footsteps of Lee Lyman, who Dr. Hall just discussed. He's worked on the Oregon coast. He's a very renowned zooarchaeologist. And in 1988, he wrote this paper, Zoogeography of Oregon Coast Marine Mammals, the last 3,000 years. And he was writing about how archaeological studies might help to answer questions about marine mammals. And in a portion of this paper was devoted to sea otters in Oregon. And he was sort of trying to suss out the relatedness of the Oregon sea otters to Alaska and California critters. And he did this with a good old-fashioned get out your calipers and measure a lot of teeth. Which is what we like to do with zooarchaeology sometimes. So in this study, he compared pre-contact archaeological Oregon sea otter tooth widths to those of some modern California specimens and modern Alaska specimens. And what he found was that all the Oregon teeth were not significantly different in size from the California teeth, and most Oregon teeth were smaller than the Alaska teeth, with the exception of one of the teeth he measured, the lower P4. And from this, he concluded that there is a clinal gradient of tooth size, so that as you're moving northward in latitude, the size of the tooth is increasing. And when he wrote this up, this is kind of interesting, he initially wanted to include this paragraph: the Alaskan sea otters transplanted to the Oregon coast in the 1970s may have been doomed from the start because of their phenotypic and implied genetic adaptation to a high latitude habitat and attendant dietary differences from sea otters in more southern latitudes. He was asked to remove that from the manuscript, but then Valentine et al., as Dr. Larson discussed, performed their ancient DNA study, and from this DNA study, they concluded that Oregon otters, as from the specimens that they measured, actually were genetically closer to modern California otters. So take from those pieces of information what you will. So his 1988 study was pioneering, but his sample sizes were quite small. So his sample sizes are there on your left. And I am fortunate to have access to an incredibly well-preserved archaeological faunal assemblage, animal remains. And so those are all the teeth that I measured. I never want to look at a sea otter tooth ever again. That's not kidding. Give them to me to measure, please. So I was working with a bigger sample size, and then I also added measurements from humeri, so your forelimb, and then femur, so your leg bone, to sort of increase the sample size, and then also to look at some other metrics in this sort of layout. So all of my archaeological remains come from Seaside, Oregon. So head north from the Partee site, which dates to around 1850 to 1,000 years ago. New dates for that just came out. And it's housed at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History in DC. Massive quantities of bone there. And then the Pomrose site, which is just located a little bit inland from Partee, dates to 2600 to 1600 BP. So it's a little bit earlier than Partee, but there is some overlap in occupation. And that collection is split between the Smithsonian and the Museum of Natural and Cultural History in Eugene. And again, so you can see on the map, sorry, I can't really point, but they're located in the town of Seaside, which is south of the mouth of the Columbia River. So it's a really quite northerly located site in terms of the map that Dr. Hall showed. For my modern specimens, I went to the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco, and I measured sea otters from mostly the San Francisco to Monterey Bay area. Those were all mostly collected in the 1990s onwards. My modern Alaska specimens, I also measured at the Smithsonian. A lot were from Carl Kenyon's 1960s work in Alaska, but there are some older specimens in the mix there as well. So this is just a map. A lot of those Alaska specimens, also it's important to note, are coming out from the Aleutian chain, especially around Amchitka. So Dr. Lyman was very supportive of this. He very, very kindly provided me with the diagrams of the tooth measurements that he used so I could replicate them. So if you've ever wanted to know what a sea otter tooth looks like, they're very bad to their teeth. This guy's got a few cavities. But so I measured the maximum buccolingual breadth. That just means from the cheek in towards the tongue. So that says the tooth sits in your mouth. I measured the minimum buccolingual breadth of the lower M1, the minimum breadth of the upper P4, and the minimum breadth of the lower P4. And then if there are any archaeologists in the room, you'll recognize von den Driesch's classic 1976 morphometrics guidelines. So I also measured proximal breadth, the width at the top, distal breadth, width at the bottom, greatest length of the humerus and femur. And then for the femur, I was also able to measure the depth of the capitum, or your femoral head. So those are all the measurements that I was working with. For statistics, if we have any statistics geeks, Lyman used t-tests, but I used a priori multiple comparisons, so I did differ from his study there. A priori multiple comparisons reduce type 2 error, and they're useful when specific outcomes are anticipated. So because I was building on Lyman's study, I thought I knew what I was looking for. I knew that I wanted to compare Alaska to Oregon and California, and I knew especially that I wanted to compare Oregon to California because I expected Oregon and California to not be significantly different. I also ran regression analyses on every measurement I took just for kicks, comparing size over latitude. What I found was that Alaska bigger than Oregon and California, Oregon bigger than California. For my femur measurements, Alaska bigger than Oregon and California, and Oregon also bigger than California. And my humeri did not behave. The data was a little funky. Most Alaska humeri were not significantly larger than Oregon and California. Oregon was bigger when you just look at the means. But once again, Oregon bigger than California. All the regression analyses, however, were statistically significant. No matter what measurement I took, as you moved north, it got bigger. So there's one pattern that I cling to. So in summary, comparing, so Lyman found that tooth width varies on a clinal gradient. I concur. But I found a less exact distribution of mean tooth widths and long bone measurements. The Oregon measurements, as I measured them here in my study, are not a perfect match with either California or Alaska. I'm not sure you should expect it to be a perfect match, but the Oregon phenotypes are also not as similar to California as Lyman's results indicated. There are some problems with my study. I'm not really controlling for chronology. I'm measuring different modern specimens than Lyman did. I kind of want to do a bigger study along these lines, just looking at Oregon otters within Oregon and see if the Oregon otters also get bigger just as you move up in the state. People have also floated the idea that maybe this is an example of Bergman's rule playing out, which is a biological phenomenon that states as latitude increases, so does the body size of mammals. I am not a biologist. Maybe some biologists in the room would like to weigh in on that once I'm done. There were other studies that I used. So Don Wilson, Dr. Larson also mentioned this one. He performed a discriminant analysis study. He measured a lot of different skull measurements and then grouped the sea otter populations based on that, or subpopulations. And they were able to find 2 pre-reintroduction Oregon sea otters. And those were grouped with the northerly forms. They were intermediate in morphology between California and Alaska, but they did lump them in with the northern groups. And then Sean Larson's 2012 microsatellite DNA paper also showed that perhaps, we discussed yesterday, it depends on the metric you're using, but showing some relatedness on both the southern and northern ends. So I mentioned these studies just because when I finished my study, I thought, oh no, I don't agree with Lyman, but perhaps I fit in somewhere more in the middle with some of these other studies as well. So future directions, I'm not done with sea otters yet. I'm in the process of planning my dissertation, and for this I plan to look at every last sea otter, juvenile, fragmented, from the Partee and Pomeroy sites. And this will hopefully create an even bigger body of data about specifically what otters were where, what they were doing, age profiles, what were the butchery patterns, what were the modifications, how were the inhabitants of these sites interacting with these animals and using these animals, how were they acquiring them? Were they picking up stranded sea otters from the beach? Were they going out and hunting? And my plug for archaeologists is it's really important that we keep doing studies like this. I'm not suggesting that I or any other archaeologist can single-handedly solve a conservation problem, but we can provide a different perspective, and we can provide these data sets from which interdisciplinary studies can draw and also help to build upon. And again, so archaeologists, just sort of the nature of our work with these animal remains, we can help reconstruct a really detailed historical ecology or environmental history for a specific species in a place and their sort of deep time interaction with humans in that place. These types of archaeological studies can be complemented and improved upon by oral traditions and traditional knowledge. I haven't yet dived, there we go, into the ethnographic resources for these sites, but that's going to be a really, really important part of my dissertation as well, and working with tribal stakeholders. And ultimately, my goal is to be of use to these diverse stakeholders, whether it's the Alliance or the indigenous stakeholders, but I want to be of service to the animal and also the humans in these issues. That's it. That was short.